Saddam Hussein promised unity and strength for Iraq. But in the summer of 1979, he turned a routine party meeting into a bloodbath. Rivals were executed in a brutal purge that cemented his absolute power. Families were shattered. Fear ruled every street. It was July 1979, and Iraq stood at a crossroads. For over a decade, President Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr had been the public face of the nation, a man whose leadership symbolized stability after years of political upheaval. Yet while his name carried weight, the real power had increasingly shifted to Saddam Hussein. As vice president since 1968, Saddam had carefully built his influence inside the Ba'ath Party, moving with precision, forging alliances, and placing loyalists in key positions. He was a master at reading political landscapes and reshaping them to his advantage. Opportunities did not simply appear for him. He made them happen. By that time, al-Bakr was visibly aging, worn down by illness and the pressures of leadership. Saddam recognized that hesitation could mean losing his chance. On July 16th, al-Bakr suddenly stepped down, officially citing health problems. But whispers in Baghdad told a different story, that Saddam had orchestrated the resignation behind the scenes, applying quiet but undeniable pressure. The transition was swift. In the space of a few hours, Saddam Hussein took on every major position of power, including President of Iraq, Chairman of the Revolutionary Command Council, Prime Minister, and Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. With that, the country's political center of gravity shifted entirely into his hands. Yet Saddam knew that in Iraq's dangerous world of politics, having a high title or an important position didn't mean you were safe. The Ba'ath Party had ruled the country since 1968, showing itself to the public as strong as united. But behind that image were cracks that could not be ignored. Inside the party, powerful men were constantly competing for influence. Old grudges never disappeared, and secret rivalries grew quietly in the background. Some senior figures had strong connections outside Iraq, especially with Syria's Ba'athist government, a regime that had once been an ally, but had broken ties with Iraq in the mid-1960s after bitter disagreements. To Saddam, these links were not harmless friendships. They were dangerous lifelines for anyone who might dream of replacing him. He understood that if he wanted to stay in power, he had to make sure everyone knew what happened to those who dared to challenge him. And he did that in mid-1979 when intelligence reports began reaching him, hinting at something far more dangerous than casual political chatter. The whispers spoke of a plot forming within the upper ranks, one that allegedly aimed to remove him from power with support from Damascus. No hard evidence was made public, but for Saddam, proof was secondary to the opportunity. Whether the conspiracy was genuine or a convenient fabrication, it offered him exactly what he needed: a justification to strike first, hard, and without warning. As the rumors spread, the air inside party meetings grew tense. Old allies eyed each other with suspicion. Conversations became shorter, guarded, almost cold. No one could be certain who was under surveillance, who might be reporting to Saddam, or who might suddenly disappear. The uncertainty worked in his favor. The more paranoia seeped through the cracks, the easier it became for him to act without resistance. Saddam knew that hesitation could allow his enemies to regroup. He would not wait for an open challenge. Instead, he began quietly planning a move that would shake the Ba'ath Party to its core. On the morning of July 22, 1979, word spread quickly throughout Iraq's political circles that the president had called for an urgent gathering of the Ba'ath Party's most senior figures. Nearly 500 of the country's most powerful men, including ministers, military commanders, and longtime party loyalists, were ordered to assemble at Al-Qild Hall, a lavish chamber deep inside the presidential palace in Baghdad. The summons was presented as official business, the kind of high-level meeting that had taken place many times before, under both al-Bakr and Saddam. Many arrived expecting discussions on party strategy, national policy, or Iraq's future under its new leader. Some chatted casually as they entered, shaking hands and exchanging polite greetings. For those who had served alongside Saddam for years, there was little reason to think this meeting would be any different from the countless others they had attended. But as they stepped into the hall, the details began to unsettle them. Soldiers in full uniform stood silently along the walls. Their weapons were not slung casually, but held ready, as if anticipating orders. When the last of the attendees had taken their seats, the heavy doors shut, sealing them inside. The room felt unusually still. Moments later, Saddam appeared. He was not in a business suit or traditional attire, but in a crisp military uniform. He was carrying a stack of papers in his hands, not the folders and binders typical of policy briefings, but loose sheets gripped tightly. Those who had arrived expecting routine discussions now felt an unease settling in. This was not the opening of an ordinary meeting. Something far more serious was about to begin. What happened next would stun the entire nation. Saddam stepped to the front of the hall with the steady confidence of a man who knew every eye was on him. At first, his words were measured, even almost welcoming, as if he were addressing loyal comrades. But as he continued, his tone sharpened. He declared that a dangerous conspiracy had taken root within the Ba'ath Party itself, a network of traitors working hand in hand with Syria to remove him from power. The claim alone was enough to send a ripple of unease through the audience. Then he revealed he was not speaking in vague terms. He held up a set of pages. It was a confession signed by Muyi Abdel Hussein Mashhadi, a trusted senior Ba'ath figure who had once served as the party's secretary general. The man who had been at the heart of the party's operations was now accused of betrayal. Guards brought Mashhadi into the hall. His face was pale, his posture stiff. He had been in custody for days, interrogated until he named names, dozens of them, as part of the alleged plot. Saddam began to read from the confession. Within seconds, armed guards moved in, gripping them firmly by the arms and leading them toward the exit. No one dared protest. The accused were not strangers to the party. They were colleagues, friends, and even relatives to some in the room. Yet no one moved to defend them. The fear was suffocating. Those left in their seats avoided each other's eyes, afraid that any glance might be misread as guilt. And this was only the beginning. Saddam was just starting to dismantle his enemies. And the next stage would make that fear spread beyond the palace walls. By the time the meeting at Al-Qild Hall ended, the shock had spread like a cold wave through the ranks of the Ba'ath Party. More than 60 senior figures had been singled out and accused of treachery in a single afternoon. These were not minor officials. Many of them had walked into the palace believing they were in good standing. Now they were being dragged out as enemies of the state. Once removed from the hall, the accused were immediately placed under heavy guard. They were taken to secure locations where interrogations began almost at once. For some, the questioning was brutal, designed less to uncover the truth and more to extract whatever name Saddam wanted to hear. Others were told they would face trial, but the reality was their fate had already been sealed before the meeting even began. The Purge's reach did not end with the man arrested that day. Families of the accused found themselves under constant watch. Homes were searched, movements tracked, and conversations monitored. Wives and children who had once enjoyed privileged lives were now treated with suspicion. Relatives holding government posts or military commands were quietly removed, ensuring that no lingering influence could survive. Saddam's message was that survival depended on absolute loyalty to him alone, and any shadow of disloyalty would destroy not only the accused, but everyone connected to them. But Saddam wanted this message to go beyond the walls of the palace and the whispers in political circles. A private purge would not have the same effect as one carried out in the public eye. He understood that fear was most effective when shared, when it reached the living rooms of ordinary citizens and the offices of every official in Iraq. A few days later, he made his move. The country's state-run television channels interrupted their usual broadcasts for a special transmission from the presidential palace. Iraqis sat down expecting an important announcement. Instead, they were shown the raw footage of the July 22nd meeting. Every moment was there. Saddam wanted the nation to see the panic in the faces of the accused, the final glances they cast around the room before being escorted out. He wanted to show that power in Iraq rested in his hands alone. The broadcast turned the purge into a national spectacle. Conversations in homes and workplaces shifted from casual to cautious. People began to weigh every word they spoke, never sure who might be listening. Friends who had once trusted each other now kept their distance. Even family gatherings grew tense. In just a matter of days, Saddam had managed to extend the fear he had unleashed at Al-Kil Hall into every corner of Iraq. And he wasn't finished yet. Within only a few days of the arrests, the accused were brought before special revolutionary courts set up to handle their cases. These were not independent legal bodies, but instruments of Saddam's will. The judges were hand-picked for their loyalty, ensuring that the outcome was never in doubt. Proceedings were swift, often lasting only hours. The accused were given little to no opportunity to defend themselves. Many were not even allowed to address the court in their own words. Evidence, when presented at all, was based on confessions extracted under duress. The trials were not about truth or fairness. They were about showing that Saddam's accusations carried the weight of law. When the verdicts came, they were as harsh as expected. At least 22 of the men were sentenced to death. Their names added to a growing list of casualties from the purge. Execution orders were carried out quickly, some within days of the trials. Several of these deaths took place at Abu Ghraib prison, a facility already notorious for its overcrowding, brutality, and the screams that echoed from its interrogation rooms. Firing squads stood ready, and the condemned were led out one by one. The executions were not only about eliminating perceived enemies. They were also a calculated loyalty test for those who remained in the party's inner circle. Saddam selected certain members, including ministers, military commanders, and rising party officials, and ordered them to personally take part in the shootings. It was a hard task that forced them to choose between killing men they had once called comrades or risking being labeled traitors themselves. This act bound them to Saddam, not just by political allegiance, but by shared guilt. Once they had taken part in the killings, there was no going back. Yet even after the bloodshed of those first days, Saddam was not satisfied. Eliminating a few dozen men was not enough to secure his control in a country where political threats could emerge from any direction. The purge would have to go deeper, reaching beyond the figures who had been present at Al-Kil Hall. Over the weeks that followed, new waves of investigations rippled through the Ba'ath Party's structure. Lower-ranking officials who showed any sign of disloyalty, whether through suspected ties to Syria, private criticism of the regime, or simple hesitation in praising the president, were removed from their posts. Many were quietly detained, vanishing into a prison system that swallowed people without a trace. The Iraqi army also came under scrutiny. Officers with the slightest hint of foreign connections, especially to Damascus, were dismissed or arrested. By the close of August 1979, the scale of the purge was clear. Hundreds had been stripped of their positions. Dozens were dead. Countless others rotted in cells, enduring years of torture, or awaiting a fate that could arrive at any moment. With his power now unchallenged at the top, Saddam began shaping Iraq into the kind of state he had always envisioned. The empty positions left behind were not given to the most skilled or experienced people. Instead, Saddam gave them to people who owed their entire survival to him. He didn't want independent thinkers. He didn't want anyone who could stand on their own without him. What he wanted were people whose careers, safety, and lives were tied directly to his rule. If he fell, they would fall too. Many of these people came from Saddam's own family or his hometown Tikrit. He trusted them more than anyone else because they shared not only blood, but also a deep personal history. He believed that they would be loyal no matter what, because if they betrayed him, they would also be destroying themselves. Two of the most powerful figures in his inner circle were Saddam's half-brothers, Barzan Ibrahim al-Tikriti and Sabawi Ibrahim al-Tikriti. Barzan was put in charge of Iraq's intelligence service, the Mukhabarat, which was one of the most feared agencies in the country. The Mukhabarat was responsible for spying on Iraqis, crushing dissent, and even carrying out assassinations abroad. Sabawi, meanwhile, took control of internal security, which meant he had power over the police and other forces that could silence anyone who spoke against Saddam. These positions were tools of total control. Through them, Saddam could make sure that any sign of disloyalty, even a whisper, would be found out and crushed before it could grow. It wasn't only family who got powerful roles. Saddam also picked young members of the Ba'ath Party who had no real political influence of their own yet. These young men were ambitious, but their ambitions depended on Saddam's favor. Without him, they would be nobodies. By giving them high positions in ministries, the military, and the security apparatus, Saddam ensured they would be forever grateful and forever loyal. But this loyalty came at a price. These men had blood on their hands. Many of them had personally taken part in the arrests, interrogations, and executions during the Purge. They had helped destroy the lives of the very people they replaced. This meant they were tied to Saddam not only by loyalty, but also by shared guilt. If Saddam fell from power, they could be held responsible for those killings. They could face the same fate as the people they had purged. So betraying Saddam was not just dangerous, it was suicidal. This created what could be called a fortress of power. It was made up of people who needed Saddam as much as he needed them. They were rewarded with mansions, luxury cars, foreign bank accounts, and total protection from the law. But they could never step out of line. They were bound together in a pact of survival. For ordinary Iraqis, the human cost of this system was devastating. The Purge had destroyed hundreds of families. Fathers and husbands were executed, leaving wives to raise children alone. These widows lived under a cloud of suspicion. They were seen not as victims, but as relatives of traitors. Their children grew up with this label hanging over them, often denied access to good schools or government jobs because of what their fathers had supposedly done. Even distant relatives of the purged could suffer. Cousins, uncles, and even in-laws were sometimes questioned by the security forces. Some lost their jobs. Others were followed or had their mail opened. In a country where government had eyes and ears everywhere, being related to an enemy could ruin your entire life. The effects of the Purge went beyond personal lives. Politically, it gave Saddam something Iraq had rarely seen before. For decades, Iraq's leaders had been overthrown in coups or assassinations. But by wiping out potential rivals before they could act, Saddam broke that cycle. There was no one left powerful enough to challenge him. This allowed him to stay in power for decades, though at the cost of turning Iraq into a one-man dictatorship. The Purge also had consequences outside Iraq. One of the most significant was the worsening of relations with Syria. Both Iraq and Syria were ruled by branches of the Ba'ath Party, but the two regimes hated each other. The Syrian leadership, especially President Hafez al-Assad, viewed Saddam's rise and his ruthless purge with suspicion. There were already ideological and personal rivalries between the two leaders, but after 1979, the hostility grew. This tension shaped Iraq's alliances for years, especially as Saddam began preparing for war with Iran. That war, the Iran-Iraq War, broke out in 1980, just a year after the Purge. The internal stability Saddam had created allowed him to focus entirely on the external conflict. With no serious opposition inside Iraq, he could mobilize the country's resources for a long and brutal war. But that stability was built on fear, and it meant that dissent, even during a devastating 8-year war, was almost impossible. This atmosphere of fear also affected Iraq's culture and economy. Artists, writers, and academics avoided controversial subjects. Plays, novels, and research papers were carefully checked to make sure they contained no criticism of the government. The economy, too, was shaped by loyalty rather than efficiency. Contracts and promotions often went to those in Saddam's inner circle, not to those with the best skills. The Purge was the foundation of Saddam's Iraq. It created a government that served one man, a society that feared him, and a political system where loyalty was more valuable than talent. And the shadow of that purge would remain burned into Iraq's history long after Saddam himself was gone.